Hello and welcome. This is Dr. Gordon Walker, and this is the Fascinated by Fungi podcast, episode 19, where we're going to talk all about truffles. So truffles are amazing, absolutely delicious fungi, but they're hidden down deep in the soil, and it's something kind of cryptic and funny and weird, and they elicit all these very strong emotions from people. I'm really excited to kind of dive into them and talk to them about about the amazing mushrooms that they are with you guys. But first, I want to talk just a couple of things. I am leading a mushroom foray on June 3rd through the 5th, and we are still looking for people to come join for the whole weekend, but we've also opened up some spots for people who want to come just hiking for the day. So if you're interested in coming just hiking to look for morels, is probably what we'll be looking for primarily, but maybe some porcini too. You'll have access to me and David Campbell, who's another very, very experienced mushroom hunter. David will have scouted too, so it'll be a really cool opportunity to get out into the hills and have a high chance of actually finding something good. So if you are interested, please email me fascinatedbyfungi@gmail.com, and I'll give you details how to sign up for that. If you'd like to support me and you like what I'm doing here with the podcast, please feel free to subscribe to my Patreon. I'm doing updates on the book, and I'll occasionally write up recipes for my followers. There's also some great benefits if you join at a higher tier, free t-shirts, stuff like that. And if you just like what I'm doing, by all means, please share my account on Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, etc. with your friends and family. You can watch some of my longer videos on Instagram. You can watch reels. There's all sorts of different ways you can kind of passively support me. Or if you want to actively support me, you can also go to my website and buy some cool mushroom merchandise. I've got great original designs. I have t-shirts, I have leggings, I have mugs, I have towels, I have all sorts of stuff. If there's anything particular you want to see, let me know, and I'll go out and stick it on a thing for you. So anyhow, let's talk about truffles. And I want to tell you guys about like my first experience of what I remember trying a truffle. Was my dad. This is before we moved to France. It was before I had a lot of exposure to fancy food. But my dad had heard about truffles. I don't know if it was Julia Child or something else. He tells the story better than I do. But he'd gone down to Formaggio's, which is a very special sort of high-end import food shop in Cambridge where we lived. And he'd gotten a black truffle. And I don't remember what the price was. It was like $50 for a tiny black truffle. Probably even, in today's money, it probably would have been even more. But he came home and he followed a very classic recipe where he wrapped it thinly in lard, put a bread, sort of panko coating on it, and baked it. And then we sliced ultra thin slices. And I don't know if you guys remember like Fantasia when Mickey is like slicing the bread and the bean ultra slim. It was kind of like that. But I remember coming down kind of casually. I must have been 5 or 6 years old, something like that, and having a bite of this and just being absolutely blown away. Here was this like weird little black thing that my dad was so excited about, and I was like, whatever, it's not going to be that great. I tried to bite, and it was absolutely mind-blowing, albeit life-changing for me to try that truffle, because it really keyed me in to something fundamental about how absolutely delicious mushrooms could be. And I was like, I want more of this. My dad's like, every single bite of this is like multiple weeks worth of allowance for you. And it didn't fully impress upon me until later in life the true cost and price of truffles. But they really are an absolutely amazing fungi. And the price of them is something that I will talk about, why they are so expensive and why they're so sort of sought after. But it has been an amazing experience to go through the rest of my life, knowing that I love truffle and, visiting fine dining establishments and stuff like that, and getting to try truffles, shaved on top of things or baked into things, or, just truffle flavored things. And now it's become really kind of popular. You see truffle flavored things all over the place. There's truffle potato chips and truffle popcorn and truffle fries at every, gastropub and stuff like that. And that's because truffles have become kind of like a buzzword for people. But like the true actual truffle, the little mushroom thing that you find in the ground, still has a ton of value. And I'll talk too about like why there's been this sort of mass spreading of truffle flavor all around, but not necessarily truffle quality. So we're going to jump in all these topics, and I'm going to try to sort of lead this through a series of questions about like, what are truffles? How do truffles grow? What is the aroma of truffles? Why are they so expensive? Why, how are they sort of picked and harvested? And then like, can you cultivate them? And so that's sort of the flow of where I'm going with the podcast. But let's start out. What are truffles? So truffles are mushrooms. there's a whole class of different kinds of mushrooms that are called hypogeous fungi. And so these are mushrooms that have evolved to live underground. Basically, that's what hypogeous means. They're under the ground. And they've done this primarily as an adaptation to low moisture conditions. So they're in environments where, if a mushroom fruited, but it wasn't raining and it was pretty arid, the mushroom get dried out before it even has a chance to mature. So hypogeous fungi and truffles have taken this gamble over millennia of evolution, where they probably started out as being a guild mushroom. If there's a basidiomycete, or if it's an ascomycete, it was probably a cup of some sort. And over time, it started getting more and more folded in. And what that was it was trying to still disperse its spores into the wind, but avoid getting dried out. And so you can find other mushroom species that are sort of in this process of becoming a truffle, where they folded in and they're protecting themselves, or they're mostly underground, but they spring up at some point. And this is evolutionary adaptation to having sort of low moisture conditions. Truffles, though, went all the way out there, and they stopped relying on wind to disperse their spores at all. Their spores are completely on the inside of the mushroom. There's not really like a spore-bearing surface like a gills or teeth or gleba, even like a puffball has, or a stinkhorn. So it's a very sort of curious thing, because why would you evolve to spores and live underground? How are you ever going to spread your spores? How are you going to get anywhere but exactly where you are? And that's where truffles get really cool, because this has been co-evolved across many different lineages of mushrooms. What we think of as truffles, the truffles we eat and put onto stuff, are generally tuber species. And so those are in the Pezial family of ascomycetes. So they're related to other cup fungi, but they have evolved to live underground hypogeously. But there's also a bunch of other basidiomycete mushrooms that evolved to be hypogeous. And there's a whole slew of different things that lives kind of as truffles. But they've all shared this common adaptation that if you're going to live underground, you have to solicit somebody to come by, dig you up, and help you spread your spores. So the way they've done that is to evolve strong aromas that attract animals. And so classic things like squirrels and chipmunks, could have been a whole slew of other megafauna too, pigs and bears. And these are very, very aromatic things when they're mature. They don't smell when they're not mature, but when they are mature and they're ready to disperse their spores, they start smelling up a storm. And so things come by and sniff them out, dig them up, eat them, mess the mushroom around, help spread its spores where it is, but they eat them and carry the spores in their gut and poop them out, ideally under other trees, and helping to sort of disperse populations of truffles like that. And there's actually a recent paper that was shared with me about, I think, a group that was studying like truffle spore dispersion in Patagonia, and they found that actually birds were a really important vector too, which is pretty cool that you can have all sorts of different animals coming down, being recruited by this amazing melange of smells that comes out of truffles, and how enticing that can be to animals of all sorts, not just us as humans. And I think that gets at sort of the core nature of a truffle, and part of what makes it so interesting to me is that this is so highly sought after among many different forms of life, not just us. I think there's other animals that think that truffles taste really, really good. So these mushrooms have clearly evolved a way to manipulate animal behavior for their own purposes. And it's funny because, most truffles are these little dark things that grow underground. It doesn't look like they have a form of intelligence, and yet here they are manipulating animal behavior. And, when I talk about the sort of worldwide trade and network of these things, it's going to become very clear that there's serious potential for human behavioral practices formed around this tiny little mushroom that's just like, one sniff of it and we're like, oh my God, I have to have that on pasta kind of thing. So I think it's pretty cool. But yeah, like I said, there are thousands of different kinds of truffles. Within the Pezial's order, there is like even 100 to thousands of different like genre of truffles. Some of the main ones are tubers. So those are, the tuber species are usually the ones that we eat as commercial truffles. Tuber melanosporum is probably one of the most famous ones. That's the Perigord French black truffle. There's also the white truffle. I'm forgetting the species name of it right now, but you can just Google a white truffle. There are rhizopogon, which are stinky, but nowhere near as nuanced as a truffle. And grow with pine. I find them all the time. You can bounce them. They kind of have the texture of like floral foam. There's Guttaria, which I've found that smells real bad. There's Geopora. The list goes on and on of all these different sort of things in the Pezial order, Ascomycete truffles that are formed, and a lot of similar process that maybe this one point in evolutionary history used to be a cup, and then kind of kept folding in on itself, fruiting deeper and deeper down underground, probably like right on the roots of a tree, but gaining the ability to produce stinky molecules. So animals would come by and dig it up. Like I said, there are also plenty of Basidiomycete mushrooms that have done this. So there's members of the Cortinarius genus, Lactarius genus, Russula, all boletes, all sorts of stuff that have evolved into truffles. And actually, I think Rhizopogon it's not an Ascomycete, it's actually a Basidiomycete that's descended from Suillus slipperjacks, and that turned into a mushroom that's down underground. And a lot of these truffles are actually very, very important to their tree hosts. And sometimes they're almost obligate things that a tree needs one of these truffles to get established, particularly in like harsh, arid environments. And so you can see there's this form of mutualism between the truffle and its host tree. And that's important because these are obligate ectomycorrhizal mushrooms. So truffles do not occur unless they're growing in association with the tree. You cannot just grow them on a pile of like dead wood like you might an oyster mushroom. And that makes them very difficult to cultivate because generally it's not economically viable to try to cultivate an ectomycorrhizal mushroom, except in the case of truffles. It is because the value of truffles can be so high. So they do associate with a lot of different trees. And like I said, there's thousands of different species of truffles. And so there's a broad array of all these different kinds of trees they can associate with. We're talking about the tuber species in particular, these European species that have high commercial value. Those are generally associated with oak and hazelnut. But you can also find truffles with stuff like beech, birch, pine. I know here in California you find wood dog fir. Up in the Pacific Northwest you can find wood dog fir. Off sometimes Christmas tree farms would be a good place to go find them. Poplar, some other hardwoods. So there's a range of different trees that can play host to these things, and that'll be important as we think about the broad evolutionary definition of a truffle and you know what they are in our environment. They're a fairly common thing to find truffles all over the world, but specifically what has the high monetary value is some of these European species. And so there's ones that fruit in winter and ones that fruit in summer. And sort of the life cycle of a truffle is that it spends, a good like 3 or 4 months of the year kind of maturing. And then in like a month or two, it matures and gets really stinky and once you dig it up. And then its spores go out and kind of reinoculate, and then the whole cycle starts over again. But there are a succession of different truffle species that fruit through summer and winter. And that's, generally fluctuating with the cost and demand of truffles as people pick them and the supply and all this sort of stuff. So there's a lot of economics that go into it. But generally, truffles really like to grow in like kind of clay, limestone, calcareous soils, kind of neutral, basic soils. And that's partially part of where their trees or host trees are probably favoring that kind of environment too. They're really important because as an ectomycorrhizal mushroom, the mycelium is there helping to absorb nutrients, help to recycle nutrients and make things bioavailable again. It's helping with water retention. It's helping to kind of hold the soil together because that mycelium is acting like a sponge and extra structure to hold all that soil in place, especially in like dry, arid environment. So it could blow away. And it's helping the trees with drought resistance because again, this is, truffles evolved as a way to exist in an environment that was kind of dry. So there was this like co-evolution of trees and truffles as they evolved to cope with environmental conditions. And it's not always that there's drought, but truffles make trees much more drought resistant if there is a drought. So that's kind of cool. As far as I know, the microbial populations associated with truffles is also really important. And there's been a fair bit of work done on different types of bacteria, endophytic fungi, and just fungi in general of populations around truffle harboring trees and, what makes that possible. Because it's not just the presence of, the mycelium of the truffle. It's all of the other things, the community members around it that make it possible for this thing to develop and may also drive some of the differentiation of smell and flavor that truffles develop too. So it's kind of cool as I was like researching this. A lot of truffle trees are sort of surrounded by almost like a little like burn area. It looks like there's around the base of some of these oak and hazelnut trees that have been that know that they have truffles under them. There'll be kind of a cleared area where there's not like plants or other fungi growing, and that has something to do with like the way that the truffle mycelium interacts with the tree roots. And I think there may also be some associated microheterotrophs that are keyed into truffles. I know rhizopogon in particular has the snow plant associated with it, and that's a really stunning, beautiful red microheterotrophic flower that grows. And I don't know about these trooper species if there's other microheterotrophs that would sort of naturally be part of their ecosystem, but I assume across the vast array of different truffles that are out there, there may be some other associations of microheterotrophs with particular types of truffle species. But for the rest of this, I'm basically just going to be talking about tuber truffles because I think the taxonomy and overwhelming number of different types of truffles gets really out of hand. And so I'm just going to talk about the tuber species and the things that are sort of commercially viable and relevant to human truffle consumption and hunting. So the aroma of truffles is something that's very, very complex. There's thousands of aromatic volatile molecules that can come off a truffle, but the majority of them that we smell and perceive are sort of sulfur-based compounds. So there is a number of different compounds. I'm just going to list off this like different chemical species that are present, and I'll talk a little bit more about them. But there's sulfur volatiles, there's alkenes, there's ketones, there's aldehydes, fatty acids, hydrocarbons, alcohols. List goes on. But the main one that we pick up is something called dimethyl sulfide, DMS, and then you also get dimethyl disulfide, trisulfide, etc. There's stuff like 2-methyl-4-dihydrothiophene. That's a mouthful. But these are compounds that stink. They are stinky because sulfur compounds smell like farts. They smell like rubber. They can smell like onions and cheese and all sorts of stuff because they're present in all sorts of different things. DMS as a molecule is classically the smell of Rolling Rock. Actually, the green bottle Rolling Rock is very much a smell of DMS or like canned corn. DMS is also a volatile molecule that comes off of like decomposing plastics and actually causes problems for seabirds because DMS is produced in large amounts by algae blooms in the ocean, and so seabirds have keyed into smelling DMS, and they'll go track an algae bloom and then dive for fish. But if it's a bunch of plastic, they end up with plastic in their stomach instead of fish. That's a whole separate side story. But again, interesting that these molecules like DMS show up again and again in animal signaling and manipulation of behavior. So the fact that truffles produce these sulfur volatiles is very clear that they are keying into animal biology and wanting to attract animals. So I think that's pretty cool. But a lot of that aroma is really fleeting because many of these things are very volatile. So they will come off of the truffle once you dig it up out of the ground. Like once you dig it out of the ground, it is overwhelmingly strong smelling. But even in the time that hunters pick it up, bring it home, it smells a little less. Every day it's out of the ground, it smells less and less. And that's because there's a change in the habitat, a change in metabolism. Often those truffles are washed off. They're losing the contact with the soil. Their microbiome is changing. The types of bacteria that are present on the surface are changing. And so there's a lot of things that are going into why the aroma of that truffle is going away and is fleeting. But it's interesting to kind of think about the chemistry of that. And there are hundreds of thousands of different like volatile molecules and stuff like that in truffles, but specifically they're sort of keyed into a set of some of these sulfur volatiles, stuff like ethylene and methylbutanol and a couple of different hydrocarbon compounds, fatty acid type things that really smell distinctively of truffles. And I believe there's also supposed to be some things in there that are sort of mimicking different animal pheromones, which has been part of like theorized of why we are so weirdly attracted to truffles, and we find that smell to be guttural and sexual and just deeply stirring because there's some things in there that speak to our biology as animals. And again, I think it's hilarious and awesome that fungi have figured that out, whether by choice and evolution because they were making other molecules that didn't attract animals, or because they like kind of just knew that these ones would work. But it's cool either way that the fungi have this incredible suite of enzymes to produce this incredible variety of volatile molecules. So truffles are amazing culinary mushrooms. They are usually shaved raw onto dishes, sort of right as you're finishing them, because those aromas are volatile. So you can cook them into things, but often they're kind of cooked. The flavor spreads really well in like fatty, rich things. They're cooked with like eggs. They're cooked in pasta sauces, lots of butter, shaved on top of things. I think sometimes like people get a little carried away. Like, do you really need to shave like a whole black truffle on top of a steak? No. Does it add that much? Arguably not really. There are certain things though, like if you cook it into like a really nice like cream sauce and then finish some gnocchi with the fresh shaved black truffle, it can like absolutely blow your mind. But it is usually an upcharge at restaurants because truffles can be very expensive. And it's a luxury item, and I'll talk a little bit about like why it's such a luxury item, because the economics of it make it that way. But it is really incredible to have truffles in your food and to try something like the black winter truffle versus like the summer white truffle, and the distinctive variations between like different truffle varieties. And that's a thing that I think gets lost, is there are different truffle varieties. Not all truffles are created equal. Some are higher value than others, like the Alba white truffles, the Italian ones, or the Perigord black truffles. Those are some of the like kind of highest echelon, highest cost truffles. And as you go down the ladder, there are some other varieties that are good and smell good, comparable, but the intensity isn't quite there, or like maybe they're lacking some of the flavor. I know that the white truffle specifically, the flavor of that is due to this 2,4 pentane molecule that apparently like is the flavor of white truffle. But there's also a whole bunch of truffles that don't smell great, and these are ones that occur elsewhere in the world. So I think a lot of the truffles that are sort of lower culinary value are ones that are often from Asia or China, and the biology of those truffles is mostly the same, except that they don't have as much of the aroma molecules, and they don't attract or excite us in the same way as a lot of these European varieties. And there's no like inherent good or bad thing about that. It's just like, if we want really stinky truffles, it's been these European varieties that people are really keyed into. The sort of interesting thing is truffles have become very in vogue and popular across society, and you find truffle flavored things all over the place now. But it's not because there's tons of truffles and we just have so many truffles we can put truffle in everything. It's because most of those products are made using truffle oil. And truffle oil is mostly just oil that's spiked with dimethyl sulfide, DMS. And then maybe they'll add like a small piece of real truffle, so they can say made with real truffle, but the truth is the majority of it is basically artificial truffle flavor. And the way that I see that is, yeah, you get truffle fries, they taste truffly, but compared to like a real truffle, compared if you're to like shave fresh truffle on top, it's kind of like hearing distorted static music blaring out through like a single speaker at a dive bar. That's what the truffle oil is. This DMS is kind of just like a very strong one note flavor, compared to sitting at the front row of a symphony and hearing like every single instrument and getting to experience the entire thing. It's so different having a real fresh truffle than having this truffle oil, because there's so much more nuance and complexity, and it's a much less sort of powerful experience in some ways, because DMS can be a very overpowering, sulfury, nasty, burnt rubber, onion funk kind of molecule, and a lot of those truffle oils are probably overdosed with the DMS. Because it does fade once you've opened the oil, and so a lot of places like overshoot a little bit, so that when you use it later, it'll still taste like truffle. But some of those things can be very unpleasant, I find. Things that are really sort of fake truffle flavored. And again, it's not fake. It's just that it's an artificial flavor, and so the difference between eating a real orange versus like a artificial orange is marked, and you can definitely tell the difference, and I think you can tell the difference too with truffles. So truffles, as I mentioned, are extremely expensive. They routinely sell for thousands of dollars a truffle. I was just looking up like what are some of the most expensive truffles ever sold, and there was some absolutely wild things where people found like 2-pound truffle that sold for like almost $120,000. It was a white truffle. It's sold to a chef, Italian chef in Hong Kong. There's a few other examples. There's one that was like it was a 4-pound black truffle. It sold for like 61,000. There was a 3.5-pound white truffle that sold for almost 330,000. There's, I think back in 99, there was one that was even like under 2 pounds, but still sold for like 330,000 in 1999. Like, absolutely wild how much people will pay for these truffles. The majority of truffles are probably roughly the size of a golf ball. And the reason they sell for so much is because they sell them at auction. And so there is this whole economy set up around buying and selling truffles. And there's a lot of middlemen involved in this. And it's because there's the loss of quality, the loss of aroma that happens with truffles means they have a very limited shelf life. So generally from picking the mushroom out of the ground to when it's going to be on your plate, you have about a 7 to 10 day window where that truffle is still in its prime and still probably worth the money that you've spent on it. So that means that the truffle has to come out of the ground, go to a middleman, get sold at auction to somebody who then probably flies to major markets like London, New York, Paris, Tokyo, San Francisco, etc. And then that person has to absorb the risk of carrying around this extremely perishable thing that they just spent a ton of money for, go to restaurants, convince the restaurants to buy their truffles. And a lot of restaurants will have like a dedicated truffle guy and a dedicated buyer, and they have a relationship there that someone comes in and is like, hey, I brought you the best truffles. And maybe to a restaurant that doesn't pay quite as much, they might bring them. They'll say, hey, I brought you the best truffles, but maybe it's not quite as good as the truffles they brought to that other restaurant, So there's a lot of bartering. There's a lot of levels of economy here. That means that the guy who picked the truffle has to make his money. The guy who bought and auctioned the truffle has to make his money. The guy who now has his truffles and is taking the risk of flying around with them and bringing them to different restaurants has to take that risk. And then the restaurant has to take the risk of the fact that they bought this thing that by the time they get it, they might only have 1 or 2 days to really put it on food before it starts losing its real oomph and its value to customers. And no one wants to be charged, let me give $50 to add truffle to your dish and truffles all over it. You're like, I can't even taste it, So there's a lot of economics because there's a lot of different middlemen that go into this. And there's also the fact that like truffles are kind of rare. There's been a decrease in the amount of habitat where truffles are found, and that's partially just deforestation. Decreasing harvests with increased demand. And that's in Europe. That's been partially because I think around the turn of the century, most of the forests of Europe are completely planted. They're artificial forests that have been planted mostly by humans. There's very little sort of wild areas left in Europe. And there's a few areas where they've been able to have some native species and stuff come back. Particularly, I think there was a success story with bringing wolves back in part of Europe. But a lot of the native forests have just been completely replaced by plantations. Thankfully, for truffle hunters, a lot of those plantations, particularly like oak and hazelnut, are good places to find truffles. And that's part of why Europe has become a preeminent place to get truffles, is simply because they planted a lot of trees that happen to be good habitat for truffles. I don't think that was intentional, but maybe now it is, because I know the truffle hunters would certainly be like, hey, plant more oaks, plant more hazelnuts. Let's inoculate these trees. Let's make sure there's more good habitat for us to keep doing our jobs of going out and finding truffles, because there's a huge economy around this kind of thing. And it is the transferring of the value every single time you sell a truffle up the chain. You have to think about the transportation costs, the admin costs, the offset of loss of value. Everyone has to take their cut, and so that's a big part of why truffles become so expensive. And there's also that moment of them being fleeting, because you can buy this really expensive thing, and it can, if you let it sit in the fridge for a week, it has lost all its value for the most part. And you can preserve truffles a little bit. That's where they take older truffles and mix them into butter or put them in oil, or put them in vodka. Those things, fats and alcohols, can absorb some of the volatile molecules and hang on to them, keep them in solution so that the truffle flavor will stick around a little bit longer. But it's still, you can't sell truffle butter for anywhere near as much money as you would a fresh truffle. So there's a real rush to get it out there, and that's part of where the cost is. Also, for those really massive truffles, there's definitely like an ego thing where people like want to buy a 2 pound truffle for $100,000 just to show it off to people and get some really crazy high roller to come in and make them a special dinner with that kind of thing. So it's definitely like a show and tell veneer kind of thing that people do too. And I think even, there's a lot of restaurants that just have truffles because they just do it because they can. Like I said, is it really worth shaving a whole truffle onto a filet mignon? Probably not. I think it would go much better on other forms of food, but they do it just so that some guy can be like, yeah, shave an extra $50 into every single plate that you bring out of the kitchen, and then they'll make more money off that kind of thing. So there's also the fact that there are imposter truffles that have integrated into the market. And those are some of those European or non-European species I was talking about. A lot of these truffles from Asia, the Himalayas and China and stuff like that, can be sold as real truffles because sometimes they'll just dose them with a little bit of truffle oil, and then they're sold off, and people who don't know enough to recognize the morphology or the inside patterns of the truffle will buy it thinking it's a real truffle, but when you shave it on, it doesn't have any of the flavor, and the truffle oil is kind of like fleeting and not a nuanced flavor anyhow. So that all really contributes to why they're so expensive. That and the fact that they're ectomycorrhizal. For the most part, truffles have to be foraged or found, and a lot of those forests are in Europe, so there has to be logistics of getting them from Europe to those major markets that I mentioned. And so it's not just that there's like a local truffle source, that the truffles are always, from the farm down the street. It's because they have to be flown around the world, they end up being so expensive. That being said, there are efforts to cultivate truffles, but it's been difficult. And the way that people are going out and harvesting these truffles is because, I'm sorry, I lost track of what I was talking about. We're going to talk about how are truffles picked and harvested, and then I'll talk about cultivation. Anyhow, stick with me. So the traditional thing everyone thinks about with truffles is that they're harvested with pigs, right? That may have been historically true, but now it's really not true anymore. And it's partially because pigs are pigs. They will go down and eat a truffle. They don't really care. If you tell a pig to stop, it doesn't stop. So a lot of truffle hunters would go grab the truffle. And unfortunately, pigs don't stop chomping. So there's a lot of truffle hunters who are missing parts of their fingers. And so I think traditionally, although pigs were used, there was a fair bit of loss that happened with the pigs. So modern truffle hunters have mostly adopted using dogs, which are easier to train and generally easier to get along with than a pig. The sort of classic variety of truffle dog is this Italian water dog called a Legato Romagnolo, big fluffy kind of poodle-esque looking dog. And I don't think there's anything particularly special about them other than that they're amenable to training. They probably have a good sense of smell. There's a lot of other different types of dogs that people will use for truffle hunting. Springer Spaniels, Beagles, Border Collies, Golden Retrievers, Poodles. Generally pretty smart dogs that have an ability to be trained well, follow direction. And the way that I've seen that people train these dogs is that they take a cork, and they'll put a drop of truffle oil on that, and they'll go hide it under trees and ask the dog to kind of go find it. And they create a feedback reward system to find the truffle, and then get the dog excited about it. And you get the dog to drop it, right? That's a very important command, because dogs will eat truffles too. They think it smells good. They might want to take a bite. But people who get truffle dogs and train them, it's a lot of work. But then they have seasonal work that they can do, because they can go to truffle farms and use their dogs there. Or if you're in Europe, you can go out and hunt areas with your truffle dog. There's a great movie called The Truffle Hunters. It's a sort of faux documentary, and it really explores a relationship between some of these truffle hunters and their dogs. It gets into competition between guys, because certain truffle hunters will poison other hunters' dogs if they think they're encroaching on their territory, and there's some real drama that can happen there. But there's also that Truffle Hunters movie is so heartwarming. There's some very, very cute characters and their dogs. It's an absolutely beautiful movie. There's also a recent movie called Pig with Nicolas Cage, I think, where he had a prize truffle pig and then he went out and got it, but kind of ignores the fact that for the most part they don't use pigs anymore, they use dogs. So that's the long and short of how truffles are harvested. And like I said, then those truffles are sold up the chain towards the auctioneers and the other people who are sort of less connected to the land. But I think those truffle hunter guys are generally pretty authentic people who like to go into the woods and hunt for mushrooms. So going back to cultivation, truffle farms are called trufferys, and they're becoming more common. The problem is they're really hard to set up, they're super expensive, and they have a really high failure rate. So generally, what they do is take oak or hazelnut seedlings, take a bunch of truffles, black truffles, i.e., expensive ones, the tubers, the white truffles, the European varieties of truffles. They put them in a blender, create some sort of like sugar solution spray kind of thing, and they spray the roots of these seedlings with truffle spores, basically, and then they plant them. And the problem is you have to get soil that's a good match. You have to then water the trees as if they were in Europe so that the fungus is developing. Generally, it means like summer rains and cold winters and some things like this. So there's a lot of issues that go into like how to get these trees established. I know that there's a bunch of wineries here in California and even up and down the West Coast where people have invested, at least initially, in a truffle farm and are then struggling because it takes anywhere between like 5 to 10 years for a truffle farm to really hit its stride and start producing a measurable amount of truffles, an economically viable amount of truffles. And within that span, I think they'll last about like 10 to 25 years or something like that. I think hazelnut's a little bit faster and oak's a little bit slower, but even still, like the prime window for harvesting is only going to be, 15, 20, 30 years at most. So there's a limited age on these truffle plantations, these trufferys, and it takes a while. So that 5 to 10 year period, you could be showing a loss on this huge investment. And the other problem is that 5 to 10 years is a lot of care and maintenance to put into a project, and a lot of businesses don't necessarily have like that long-term vision, or someone, the guy who planted it was really excited about it, but then he leaves, take another job, and someone else is like, I don't know, why are we wasting so much water in these stupid trees? What are we going to get out of it? Not realizing maybe like the true value of truffles. But the other problem too is here in California, we need water. We desperately need water. We live in a drought. And so like watering a bunch of trees during summer seems kind of like a bad investment if you're a winery and you're trying to keep your grapes alive. So I have mixed feelings about people trying to create trufferys here in California. I hope they work. I really do. It'd be awesome to have some like locally grown truffles. But again, the problem is they're using European trees and European truffle species, so it doesn't really match our environment. There has been a lot more luck down in Australia and New Zealand, I think, with getting trufferys established there. And it's not that the weather's that much different or water is any less precious. New Zealand has plenty of water. Australia definitely has the same issues we have here in California. I think it has something to do with there potentially being less competition in the soil. So there's less fungal populations there in the soil. And that's partially because they've been deforested and completely denuded of their like native soil microbiota. I know in New Zealand that was a big problem where they ripped out all of the native forests and then it's just grass and like, bare earth. And so maybe it's actually been easier to get those truffle communities established there because there's less competition in the soil. May also be related to other, microbiota factors of the types of bacteria that are present. And I do know one of the issues that happens here in the United States and probably around the world when you try to set up a truffery is the contamination with some of those other truffle varieties, so other tuber species, the ones that come from Asia that don't taste as good. You may not know until you're 5-10 years down the road that like you had a contamination event and now your entire truffle orchard, while it has truffles, they're not truffles that have much economic value. And so I think there's so much risk that goes into this stuff, and it's part of why truffles maintain their value, because there's this increasing demand for this kind of luxury product. There's increasing awareness of stuff like truffles, so more and more people want to eat them, want to try them. There is definitely like a culture of people like putting truffle on things in this very excessive, ostentatious kind of way. But man, they are good when they're good, right? So it's also really cool to me because there's quite a few scientists out there, and this shouldn't be surprising because the economic value of these truffles. There are scientists in labs trying to optimize truffles for cultivation, make them easier to cultivate, maybe to have them fruit faster or fruit more. They're optimizing on the basis of like genetics and screening. They're looking at flavor, potentially shelf life. So there's things where people are trying to select for truffles that might be a little bit easier to grow and maybe taste better for longer kind of thing, or just taste better in general. More of the compounds that we find tasty in mushrooms. So that's happening. But what's almost more interesting to me than trying to optimize the European varieties of truffles that we have is there's actually a lab here in the United States, and I found out about this because I met a graduate student at a mushroom festival last summer, Judd Van Wyck, super smart guy. He's working in the Bonito lab at Michigan State University, and they've been out harvesting, sampling local and endemic truffle populations around the United States, trying to find different types of truffles, just identifying them, doing taxonomy, basic science work, but also keeping an eye on like what smells good, what tastes good, and then can we cultivate these things? And I believe their mission statement, one of the things they're trying to do is find some endemic North American truffle species that grow in association with native trees here in the United States and North America, and then start cultivation projects based around those native trees. So instead of planting like in European varieties of trees and mushrooms, we'll find our own varieties of truffles here in the United States that taste as good, if not potentially better, than some of the European species. And that's really just bringing awareness to the fact that truffles are not that rare around the world. They're pretty common. They're hidden. They're cryptic. They're down in the soil. But there's such a vast diversity of different kinds of truffles that maybe we're missing out by only focusing so solely on those European truffles. So I just think that's a really cool concept, and I'm super excited for the future of truffles and seeing what comes out of people doing more research into the subject, and hoping that some of these trufferys come online. And I don't really see the cost of truffles going down at all, because luxury items that they'll throttle the supply if there ends up being too many truffles. But I like truffles, and if you want to try truffles, I would stay away from the oils. The butters are pretty good; they'll last a while. A real simple thing you can do is just scramble some eggs, add a little bit of heavy cream, put some salt in there. Don't skimp on the fat when you're going to do this. Put a good, nice big of butter, knob of butter in a pan, really low heat. Put the eggs in and just barely kind of cook them through so they're still pretty goopy. And then melt in a bunch of truffle butter right at the end. If you have fresh black truffle, shave that on too. And that's just like simple truffle eggs. It's one of the simplest things you can do, but it is so, so good. Other tips on truffles: if you have a truffle, definitely try to maximize it. One of the things people do is they'll store them in the fridge with like arborio rice and maybe an egg in with the truffle, because that flavor kind of infuses into the rice and into the egg, so you can make a truffle risotto or make scrambled eggs like I talked about. There's different ways to preserve it and different ways to experience truffles, but I definitely recommend, like, if you have a chance, try to go buy a good one. Look up a good recipe for truffles. Like, rich, creamy, fatty stuff goes really well with truffles. Potatoes are great. Starchy, creamy stuff is phenomenal with truffles. Don't try to like put them with red wine. There's some flavors that are really strong. Tomatoes and red wine and some things like that can completely blast a truffle out of the water. But simpler things like potatoes, cream, pasta can just pair absolutely beautifully and highlight that incredible diversity of aroma and that sort of deep, guttural, animalistic thing that we get out of truffles. And it just really tickles the inside of your brain and hopefully makes you passionate and interested and excited about truffles in the way that I have been. So anyhow, that is this week's episode of the Fascinated by Fungi podcast. As always, if you'd like to learn more from me, please visit my website, fascinatedbyfungi.com. I've got cool merch. I've got About Me page. I've got an FAQ page where I answer a lot of your common questions. I've got links to the mushroom discount stuff, so you can get money off on ordering kits, on the mushroom knife you see me always using, different supplements and food products, all sorts of good stuff there. Please follow me on all the social medias. I've got Instagram, I've got YouTube, TikTok, Pinterest, Twitter, Twitch, Facebook, all these things. If you want to support me, please subscribe to my Patreon. As always, I will be back next week with something else to talk about that's interesting. If you have feedback for me, let me know. I'm happy to tackle a subject that you guys suggest. You can reach me, fascinatedbyfungi@gmail.com. And if you're interested in signing up for that morel foray, either for the whole weekend or just the day hike, shoot me an email and I'll get you hooked up with the details for that. So anyhow, I hope you guys have a good week and wishing you all much love. Bye-bye.